Jack Turner and his dog Shadow found shelter in a tiny mobile home parked at the edge of nowhere. It leaned with the wind, rusted and quiet, but it was theirs. Then Shadow started barking at a dry trench behind the trailer, where the ground cracked like old memories. When Jack dug there, the past began to breathe again, one welded line at a time. If you love stories where broken men and broken homes find their way back to life, hit like and subscribe. The road to Dry Creek looked like it hadn't seen a soul in a decade. Dust rose behind the old pickup like a ghost that couldn't decide whether to follow or fade. Jack Turner gripped the wheel, the tendons in his hands stiff as wire. He'd been driving for 8 hours, with nothing but the radio's static and the heavy breath of his German Shepherd Shadow pacing in the passenger seat. Every few miles the dog leaned forward. Ears pricked, as if expecting something to appear out of the wasteland, another life, maybe the one they'd both lost. The mobile home came into view as the sun slumped behind the hills, its light dragging across the horizon like a dying match. The trailer wasn't much dented aluminum, a patched tin roof, a sagging porch, but it stood, and that was more than Jack could say for himself. He parked, killed the engine, and sat for a moment, letting the silence of the land swallow the ticking of the cooling motor. Shadow whined softly, tail brushing the cracked leather seat. "Yeah," Jack muttered. "Home sweet home." He stepped out into the dry wind boots crunching against gravel. The air smelled of sage and dust. The old man who'd sold him this patch of Montana dirt hadn't lied. It was cheap, barren, and forgotten. But it was his. For the first time in years, the word mine didn't sound like an accusation. Inside, the trailer was smaller than he remembered from the photos. The ceiling bowed slightly in the middle, the floor creaked, and the air carried that familiar scent of metal and mildew. A place abandoned long enough to forget its own name. Jack dropped his duffel on the couch, rubbed his neck, and looked around. There were the remnants of another life. A coffee mug with the rim chipped, a faded calendar from 2008, a single boot by the door, its mate long gone. He felt like an intruder in someone else's unfinished sentence. Outside, the wind pressed against the trailer's sides, making them groan like an old man turning in bed. He turned on the tap out of habit. The faucet spat air and then silence. Of course. No water. He'd been told that. The entire valley's well rights had dried up years ago when the county cut off the old lines. But for a man who'd lived out of his truck for 6 months, a dry tap was still better than a night in the back seat. Shadow patted inside nose, working the corners, tail low but steady. Jack smiled faintly. The dog adjusted faster than he did. "You're not picky, huh?" he said. Shadow looked up, eyes catching the faint light leaking through the blinds. There was a steadiness in that gaze, something Jack used to see in mirrors before the desert took it away. He leaned against the counter, pulled out the small photo from his wallet, 2 men in uniform laughing dust on their faces, the desert stretching behind them. The other man, Mason, had been the kind who believed in rebuilding what war broke. Jack folded the photo, slid it back, and took a long breath. "Guess I'm doing it, buddy," he said softly. "Starting over." He stepped outside to watch the last of the sunset bleed out across the hills. The land was wide and silent, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but waiting. Somewhere, a hawk called, and the echo carried far. Maybe he thought this was what healing looked like, a trailer with no water and a sky big enough to swallow everything that still hurt. When night settled, he sat on the steps, a tin cup of instant coffee in hand. Shadow at his feet. The stars came in waves, sharp and cold. He could hear the faint hum of the highway miles away, the sound of people still moving forward. He wondered if he could do that again. Start small, fix a wall, patch a roof, one thing at a time. The moon rose pale and patient, and for the first time in years he didn't drink to fall asleep. He just sat listening to the creak of the land and the slow breathing of his dog. The next morning broke without sound, just light creeping through the thin blinds and laying across the floor in stripes. Jack woke before the sun fully cleared the ridge. Years in the service had wired him that way. No alarm, no hesitation, just the soft click of habit. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed, rubbing the stiffness from his knees, and listened to the land breathe. It was quiet, but not dead. There was a hum beneath it, faint but steady, the kind you only hear when you stop trying to fill silence with noise. Outside, Shadow was already pacing tail low, head turning toward the back of the property. Jack watched him through the window for a while, the way the dog's movements changed, tense, alert, the kind of focus that wasn't about chasing rabbits. Something else had his attention. He stepped outside the boards, creaking beneath his boots, and whistled softly. "What is it?" Boy Shadow trotted to the far edge of the yard, nose pressed low, then stopped at a shallow dip in the earth about 20 feet behind the trailer. The soil there looked different, lighter cracked in long jagged lines that spread like veins across the ground. Jack crouched, ran his hand over the surface. The dirt crumbled beneath his fingers, bone dry, but soft underneath as if it had once held moisture. He frowned, tracing the contour of the hollow. It wasn't random. It curved gently, a shallow trench that disappeared behind a patch of sagebrush. He'd seen shapes like that before, half a world away, where rivers had once run before the sand swallowed them. "Looks like a drainage line," he murmured more to himself than to Shadow. The dog tilted his head, panting quietly, then started pawing at the edge, scattering dust. Jack took a closer look, the sun climbing higher, heat settling on his back. There were fragments mixed into the dirt, pieces of corroded metal, smooth and rounded. He picked one up and turned it over. The rim was threaded like part of a pipe joint. Industrial, not household. He rubbed the rust off with his thumb and felt a familiar pull in his chest. It had been years since he touched anything that reminded him of work he used to do, field repairs. Water systems, makeshift infrastructure in places the world pretended didn't exist. He pocketed the piece, glanced at the dry trench again, and stood. "We'll look later," he said, but Shadow didn't move. The dog's gaze stayed locked on the horizon, muscles taut. The kind of stillness that said something was wrong, even if you couldn't name it. That afternoon, Jack drove into town for supplies. The hardware store sat on Main Street, wedged between a shuttered diner and a post office that looked older than the town itself. The clerk, a woman with sunburned cheeks and a voice like gravel, helped him find what he needed. PVC couplings tape a cheap spade. She asked where he was fixing lines, and when he mentioned his property off of County Road 12, her expression changed just slightly, a flicker of recognition before she masked it with politeness. "That's the old Dry Creek lot, isn't it?" she said. "Haven't heard anyone moving out there in a long time." Jack nodded. "Picked it up from Harris," he said. The woman paused mid-count. "You might want to stay clear of the back section," she said finally. "There used to be a storage site out there, Army stuff. They closed it after some contamination thing back in the 80s. Nothing dangerous now, I suppose, but folks around here still don't like to talk about it." Jack felt something tighten in his gut. A dull pressure that came whenever the past brushed too close. "A base?" he asked. "More like a logistics yard," she said. "Fuel tanks, maybe some water lines. They called it a cleanup project, but from what I heard it was more like a cover-up." She shrugged, bagging his items. "All that's left now is dust and bad memories." On the drive back, the wind picked up sweeping thin lines of dirt across the road. Jack gripped the wheel, the woman's words looping in his head. A logistics yard, water lines, fuel. It all matched what he'd seen behind the trailer. When he reached home, the light was turning gold, stretching long shadows across the ground. Shadow was waiting at the same spot, standing guard like he hadn't moved all day. Jack knelt beside him, running a hand through his fur. "You smell something, don't you?" The dog's ears twitched, and he gave a low, uneasy sound that wasn't quite a growl. Jack followed the trench's path again, this time with purpose. He moved the brush aside and found where the ground dipped steeper. There were faint rectangular impressions, half buried in dirt foundations, maybe. He scraped the surface with his boot and uncovered a fragment of poured concrete, the edge beveled like old military construction. He stood still, the evening air cooling against his skin. Memories flickered, disjointed work crews and uniform pipes laid under foreign soil, men joking about how they were building water for ghosts. He hadn't thought about that phrase in years. Shadow nudged his leg, snapping him out of it. Jack looked around at the wide-open hills and the endless, dry sky, and for the first time since arriving, he felt like the land was watching him back. The following week brought wind that never stopped blowing, a dry whisper that worked its way through cracks in the trailer and carried the smell of dust and metal. Jack had been meaning to fix the water line since he arrived, but after finding the trench behind the property, the thought of working underground stirred something heavier than the task itself. Still, a man needed running water more than ghosts. He pulled on his gloves and started early, the air still cool, the sun barely over the ridge. Shadow stayed close, circling him as he dug near the old valve outside the trailer. The ground was stubborn, a mix of packed clay and broken roots. Every few inches, the shovel struck rock, sending a vibration up his arm. Figures, he muttered, catching his breath. Shadow stood still, ears twitching at the sound, as if listening for something deeper. Jack crouched beside the hole, using the small spade to clear the dirt around the pipe. He expected to find the narrow PVC typical of mobile homes, something patched and rusted. But the metal that emerged was thicker, dark with age, the kind of pipe built for pressure, not plumbing. He brushed the dirt away and felt his pulse quicken. The diameter was too wide, at least 8 inches. The surface bore layers of corrosion, but the weld seams were clean, precise. Whoever had laid it knew their craft. Jack leaned back on his heels, sweat beating at his temple. "This isn't part of the trailer system," he said quietly, as if speaking might change what he was seeing. He followed the pipe's direction, tracing it with the tip of his glove. It ran straight south, disappearing into the hardpan beyond his fence, the same direction the old woman had said the base once stood. He looked up at the horizon, where the land sloped gently downward into the distance. Something in his chest tightened, not fear, but recognition. He knew this kind of line, the engineering, the logic, the joints designed to resist ground shift. He had done this before. Not here, but somewhere hot and far away under orders he barely remembered. He kept digging, the sound of the shovel rhythmic, steady, like breathing. The pipe stretched further than expected, each foot of progress revealing more of its strange persistence. He stopped when the shovel struck something harder than steel, a coupling. The weld joint gleamed faintly beneath the dirt, as if it had been sealed yesterday instead of decades ago. Jack ran his hand over it, tracing the ridges where the torch had passed. The weld pattern was distinctive, almost familiar. He tilted his head, squinting. Every welder had a signature, an unspoken rhythm, and this one looked like his own. The thought sent a chill down his back. He scraped more dirt away, exposing a stamped marking near the seam, QMC 79. His breath caught. Quartermaster Corps Line designation QMC 79, the same corps he'd served under during his early years back when his world was defined by blueprints orders and the illusion that building something always meant doing good. He sat back slowly, the shovel resting across his knees. The sun had climbed higher, throwing harsh light over the hole. Shadow moved closer, his shadow stretching long across the dirt. Jack stared at the marking until the letters blurred his mind, rifling through old memories that refused to stay buried. He could still see the camp tents in the desert, the rows of pipes stacked like ribs, the sergeant shouting over the roar of welding torches. They'd been told the system was for humanitarian relief, temporary infrastructure for displaced civilians. But when the project ended abruptly, they'd been ordered to seal everything, dismantle nothing, and walk away. No explanations. He had done it because that was what soldiers did. Obey, don't question. He pressed his fingers against the pipe, the metal still cool despite the sun. "We built something like you," he whispered, the words barely audible. Shadow tilted his head, watching him with those amber eyes that never seemed to miss a thought. Jack stood and looked out toward the south. The valley spread before him, quiet and different. It felt wrong now, the silence too deep, as if the earth itself had secrets it didn't want disturbed. He went back to the trailer, fetched a small wrench, and returned to the pit. He tried loosening one of the bolts near the coupling, but it wouldn't budge. It was sealed for permanence, the kind of permanence only government work demanded. He sat beside it again, thinking. If this was part of the old military system, there should have been records permits, maybe even storage maps. But the town clerk had said the cleanup project destroyed most of the files. He brushed more dirt away, searching for another marking, and found a faint imprint on the lower edge numbers too worn to read completely. He could make out a fragment of 79. D.C. District Command. Dry Creek. He didn't know, but one thing was certain: the pipe wasn't meant for irrigation. It was part of something bigger, something hidden beneath all this forgotten land. Shadow barked suddenly, once sharp and low. Jack turned. The dog stood at the edge of the property, facing the same southern line the pipe followed, fur raised slightly along his spine. The wind shifted, carrying a scent of rain that never came. Jack looked back down into the trench, then toward the horizon, and felt a weight settle in his chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion. The following morning, Jack woke to the steady clank of the loose gutter outside, the sound tapping like a metronome against the trailer's metal skin. He lay still for a while, eyes open to the ceiling, mind turning over the same question that had kept him awake most of the night. QMC 79. The marking on the pipe hadn't left his thoughts. It sat there in his mind like a piece of shrapnel that wouldn't work itself out. When the sun came up full, he brewed coffee on the small propane stove, staring out the window at the faint line of disturbed earth running toward the south. Shadow lay by the door, head resting on his paws, eyes following Jack's every move, as if waiting for him to decide what to do next. Jack drained the last of his coffee, grabbed his cap, and said, "Let's go find some answers." The town hall sat 2 blocks off Main Street, a squat brick building with a flag that barely stirred in the still air. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and old floor polish. Behind the front desk sat a clerk in a denim shirt, the kind of man who looked like he had been part of the town longer than the furniture. Jack introduced himself and said he was trying to locate old utility maps for a property near Dry Creek. The clerk squinted at him, then shrugged. "We got partial archives down in records," he said. "Most of that area's under environmental protection now." "What do you need them for?" Jack hesitated, then said, "Water lines. I'm trying to fix a connection." The man raised a brow. "That far out? You're lucky if you hit anything that still works." He led Jack to the basement, where rows of metal cabinets hummed under fluorescent lights. The air was cool and smelled of rust. The clerk left him there with a stack of keys and a half smile that said good luck. Jack started opening drawers, flipping through maps wrapped in plastic sleeves. Most were modern zoning charts, the kind used for tax parcels. But in one cabinet labeled Infrastructure 1970-1990, he found what he was looking for: blueprint survey grids, topographic overlays. He spread them across the long table, tracing his property by its coordinates. The maps were hand-drawn ink, slightly faded. A faint blue line ran right through the area of his lot, an old water conduit marked Line B, Reservoir 6. His eyes followed it south until it ended in a shaded rectangle labeled Federal Reserve QMC Water Containment Unit 1979-1989. He frowned, scanning the notes along the margin. There, stamped in red, were 2 words that sent a chill up his neck: Decommissioned Post-Explosion 1989. He leaned closer. A handwritten annotation beside it read, "Site, sealed under EPA supervision. Contamination risk unverified." Jack's stomach tightened. Explosion. Reservoir. That explained the sealed pipes, the missing water rights, maybe even why the town avoided the subject altogether. He folded the map halfway, slipped it under his arm, and went back upstairs. The clerk looked up from his desk, curious. "Find what you needed." Jack nodded slowly. "Mostly. Do you happen to have records on the crew who worked that containment project?" The man scratched his chin. "Might be in personnel logs, but those are spotty. A lot of the military stuff got transferred or shredded after the cleanup." Jack waited while the man rummaged through a set of binders, pulling one thick with yellowed pages. He thumbed through it until his finger stopped. "Here's one. Civil engineering support contracted through the Corps." He slid the binder across the counter. "Most of these fellas were temporary hires, but it lists supervisors." Jack flipped through the pages, scanning columns of names and unit codes. His eyes moved quickly until they stopped. Line 42. Turner Jr., Civil Ops Technician 3rd Division Temp Assignment. Spring, 1989. The room tilted just enough to make him grip the counter. His thumb hovered over his own name. He had been there on that very project. The reservoir that exploded, the one buried and forgotten, had once been under his command. He read the date again, 1989. He would have been 26 still in uniform, still convinced that service meant purpose. But he didn't remember this assignment. It wasn't in his discharge papers, not in any of his old logs. The realization hit like cold water. Someone had erased it. He flipped through the binder again, looking for notes, signatures, anything else that could confirm it, but the page was bare except for that one line. No rank, no clearance code. Just his name. Shadow shifted at his feet, restless, as if sensing his change in heartbeat. Jack closed the binder, thanked the clerk, and stepped outside. The air felt sharper cutting across his face as he crossed the street. He sat on the edge of the fountain in front of the courthouse, the map unrolled on his knees. The lines seemed to pulse under the sunlight, blue ink turning darker with every breath. He traced the path from his trailer to the reservoir again, the way a man retraces his own footprints. The pipe wasn't random. It had been part of that system, the same one they'd sealed after the blast. And if his name was in the record, then he hadn't just inherited that land, he'd helped create what lay beneath it. He folded the map slowly, careful not to tear the brittle edges, and stared at the horizon beyond the rooftops. The mountains were distant and pale, and the wind carried the faint scent of rain that still refused to fall. The drive back from town was quiet except for the sound of gravel beneath the tires. Jack's thoughts circled like a convoy without destination. The map on the passenger seat shifted each time he turned, whispering against the paper. His own name, written on that old roster, haunted him like a voice half-remembered. When he reached the trailer, the air was still and heavy. The sun sat low over the hills, bleeding into the dust. Shadow met him at the porch, tail stiff, body alert. The dog had been waiting, eyes fixed on the ground behind the trailer where the dry trench cut across the yard like an unhealed scar. Jack crouched, running a hand over the dog's head. "You remember where we left off?" he asked quietly. Shadow's ears flicked forward as if in answer. Jack grabbed the shovel from where it leaned against the wall and walked to the trench. He had stared at that line long enough. Now he needed to see where it ended. The first few feet came easy, loose dirt that broke under the blade. Then the ground turned hard, compacted with time. Each thrust of the shovel sent small shocks through his arms. Sweat gathered beneath his collar, dust clinging to his skin. Shadow stayed close, pacing, barking once in a while toward the far end of the trench. Jack paused, wiping his brow, and followed the dog's line of sight. "That spot," he said, pointing. Shadow barked again, sharper this time. Jack nodded. "All right, let's see." He moved toward the point where the ground dipped slightly the same direction the pipe ran toward the south. He began digging there, each scoop heavier than the last. After half an hour, the shovel hit something solid with a hollow clang. He crouched, brushing the dirt away with his hands. The steel beneath was darker than the pipe he had uncovered before, coated in a dull film that cracked under his fingers. It wasn't broken or corroded, it was sealed. He followed the line until he reached the end where the pipe terminated in a circular cap welded shut. The seam was smooth, deliberate. He leaned closer, tracing the weld with his thumb, and felt his chest tighten. It wasn't a rough field job. It was meticulous control done by someone who knew how to make a closure permanent. The kind of work he used to pride himself on. He reached into his tool bag, pulled out a small wire brush, and scrubbed lightly at the seam. Beneath the rust-faint markings appeared the ghost of a serial number, production code, and the faint outline of an official stamp, U.S. Army Corps. The letters bled through the grime like a confession. Jack sat back, the wind tugging at his shirt. Shadow whined softly, circling near the hole, his paws leaving prints in the dry dust. Jack stared at the weld again, at the way the metal folded into itself like a scar. He had seen that technique before, not just in training, but in the field where precision mattered more than speed. The angle of the bead, the double, past the slight overlap at the joint. It was identical to the method he had been taught and used countless times. His breathing slowed. "This looks like my work," he said under his breath. The words felt strange in the air, like they belonged to someone else. He thought back to the records he'd seen in town, the reservoir project, the explosion, the sealed site. They had buried it in 1989. He would have been there just months before his discharge. He remembered fragments heat the buzz of welders, the smell of burning flux. Orders coming down to finish fast to seal everything. No explanation, just orders, and he followed. He was a soldier. Following orders was how he survived. But standing there now with the weight of the shovel in his hands and the quiet press of the land around him, he felt something colder slip through him. He knelt again, fingers tracing the weld. The edges of memory, stirred voices shouting over the noise of machinery, a supervisor barking for tighter seals, talk of a leak that couldn't be contained. He saw flashes of light, the sound of pressure venting the smell of wet earth turning to steam. Then nothing. The rest was blank, wiped away like a page torn from a journal. He looked up at Shadow, who had stopped moving, gaze fixed on him with quiet intensity. Jack's throat tightened. "Did I do this?" he whispered. The dog's ears flicked back at the sound of his voice, and for a moment Jack thought he saw understanding in the animal's eyes. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of something, faint oil maybe, or rust long buried. He turned toward the horizon where the hills darkened in the setting sun. Somewhere beyond them lay the remains of the reservoir he'd helped build and bury. He picked up the shovel again, hands steady now, and cleared more dirt from around the seal. The steel caught the last light of day, a dull gleam waiting to be uncovered. The next day, the sky carried a strange stillness, the kind that made a sound travel farther than it should. Jack sat at the small table in the trailer, staring at the map he had brought back from town, the lines now smudged from his fingers. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, untouched. Shadow lay near the door, watching the road through the open window. Every few minutes, the dog's ears flicked, picking up something distant. Jack followed the gaze but saw nothing, just the road, the hills, the stubborn quiet. Then came the crunch of tires on gravel. Shadow stood tail-stiff, body angled toward the sound. Jack rose slowly, setting the mug aside. A white SUV rolled up to the gate, sunlight flashing off its hood. The SUV was too clean for this road. A man stepped out, mid-40s, suit jacket over jeans, mirrored sunglasses, and a practiced smile. "Mr. Turner," he called out, voice smooth. Jack didn't answer immediately. He stepped off the porch, Shadow pacing close beside him. The man stopped a few feet away, extending a hand that Jack ignored. "My name's Douglas Haynes," he said, adjusting his cuff. "I represent Evergreen Development Group. We're working on a solar expansion project across this region, and your property happens to fall within our proposed zone." Jack folded his arms. "You came a long way to tell me that." The man chuckled softly, as if humoring a child. "We're offering buyouts to landowners before the county rezoning. It's a fair price. In fact, it's generous." He opened his briefcase, produced a folder, and handed it over. Inside were glossy renderings, fields of mirrored panels stretching across the valley, glowing under bright skies. At the bottom was a contract and a check slip already filled out with an amount that made Jack's stomach twist. It was too much. Far too much for land like this. "We can transfer immediately," Haynes said smoothly. "You'd be helping the state move toward clean energy, a win for everyone." Jack looked at him, studying the posture, the way his eyes darted to Shadow, each time the dog shifted. "Why here?" he asked. "You've got miles of open land south of the highway." Haynes smiled again, thin now. "Proximity to the grid," he said. "Efficiency. You understand logistics, I'm sure." Jack said nothing. The man's shoes were coated in dust that didn't belong to this soil. Darker clay-rich from the south. The direction of the old reservoir. "I'll think about it," Jack said finally, closing the folder. "Of course," Haynes replied, though his tone said he'd already decided otherwise. "We'll be in touch." He turned to leave, but before he reached the SUV, Shadow gave a low growl, deep and steady. The man hesitated, then climbed in and drove off, leaving behind a trail of dust that hung in the air long after he was gone. Jack stood there for a while, the folder heavy in his hand. Inside, the pages smelled faintly of fresh ink and something chemical. He went back inside, dropped it on the table, and stared at the company name printed across the top. Evergreen Development Group. He had never heard of it. He turned on the old laptop he'd been using for odd repair jobs and waited for the sluggish connection to load. The website looked professional, clean energy sustainability, all the right words. But when he scrolled to the bottom, a small line of text caught his eye, subsidiary of Corwin Industries. The name hit him like a punch to the chest. Corwin Industries had been one of the main contractors on the QMC containment project, the same one that built and later sealed the reservoir. Corwin had faced lawsuits decades ago for groundwater contamination, but all cases were dismissed or sealed under national security clauses. Evergreen was their new face, a fresh coat of paint on an old machine. Jack leaned back, exhaling slowly. They weren't building solar fields. They were covering their tracks. If they acquired the land, they could excavate quietly, remove evidence, and rezone the area as industrial, erasing any link to military contamination. His name on the old roster meant nothing compared to what they'd lose if this came to light. He turned to Shadow, who had settled near his boots again. "They are not here for the sun, are they?" The dog blinked slowly, as if he too understood the pattern. Jack looked at the folder again, at the signature line, waiting for his pen. The price could have solved every debt-bought comfort, maybe even peace. But the thought of signing it felt like welding another seal, shut another silence. He picked up the folder, tore the check in half, and watched the pieces fall into the trash. Then he opened his laptop again, searching for the environmental records of the county, scrolling until the same company names began to appear in government contracts. The dates lined up. 1989, the same year as the explosion. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Every document ended with the same notation: remediation classified under Section 41B Federal Operations. Buried under paperwork just like the land itself. He shut the laptop and looked out the window. The SUV was long gone, but the dust still lingered, drifting slowly over the field like a warning that hadn't yet settled. The morning after the man from Evergreen left, the air felt different, charged in a way that made the smallest sounds echo sharper. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the visit hadn't been random. He spent hours pacing between the table and the window, replaying the man's voice, his smile, the way he'd avoided eye contact when asked about the land. By evening, Jack decided he couldn't carry it alone. He pulled out his old phone, scrolled through a few numbers, and paused on one name: Emily Rayner, a reporter from the Flathead Gazette. They had met years ago when she covered veterans programs. She was tough sharp, and most importantly, she listened. He dialed her number, hesitating only once before pressing call. When she answered, her voice carried that same mix of curiosity and caution he remembered. Jack Turner, been a while. He explained the basics: the land, the pipe, the company offering to buy him out. He mentioned Corwin Industries and how the maps linked back to an explosion the town had quietly erased. There was silence on the line for a few seconds, then the sound of her pen scratching. "You sure about this?" she asked. "Because if you're right, it's not just an old scandal, it's a cover-up." Jack hesitated, then said, "I'm sure." She promised to drive out that weekend to see the site herself. When they hung up, he felt something he hadn't in months, a flicker of relief. Someone else knew. He wasn't alone in the wait anymore. That night, the wind came in from the south, carrying the faint smell of rain that never reached the ground. Shadow barked once restless, then settled near the door. Jack double-checked the locks before lying down. Sleep came in fragments. The next morning, the sound of a truck passing on the main road woke him. He dressed, fed Shadow, and spent most of the day repairing the back steps. By sunset, Emily hadn't called. He figured she was still on the way, but when darkness fell, something felt off. Shadow lifted his head suddenly, ears pricked, a low growl rolling from his throat. Jack froze, listening. There a faint metallic click near the porch. He grabbed the flashlight, moving quietly to the window. Nothing. Just shadows shifting against the truck. He waited another moment, then stepped outside, scanning the yard. The air was still heavy with silence. He walked the perimeter once, saw nothing disturbed, and finally went back inside. It wasn't until morning that he realized what had changed. The front door's lock had fresh scratches near the latch. Someone had tried to force it open. Inside, the papers he'd left on the table were scattered across the floor drawers, half pulled the cabinet open. Shadow limped slightly as he followed Jack through the room, a thin cut visible on his side. Jack knelt beside him, voice steady but low. "Easy, boy." He cleaned the wound, his hands shaking despite his calm tone. The injury wasn't deep, but it was deliberate. Whoever had come in hadn't just been searching, they had wanted to send a message. Jack gathered the papers, checking what was missing. The folder from Evergreen was gone, along with the copies of the old maps he'd brought from the courthouse. But one document lay half crumpled under the couch, a stack of photographs he hadn't noticed before, printed on matte paper, official markings along the edges. Their presence felt deliberate, a warning more than a clue, as if someone wanted him to know he was being watched and to steer the story on their terms. He flattened them out on the table. They were satellite images, old and grainy. The first few showed the valley before the reservoir, wide and green. The next, taken years later, revealed the containment site, massive circular, ringed with equipment and temporary shelters. But one photo caught his attention. It showed a cluster of tents and makeshift structures along the edge of the project, marked simply as Zone 3, B Displacement Support. The date on the corner read June 1989, the same month as the explosion. Jack's chest tightened. He flipped to the next image. The area that had once held the tents was gone, swallowed by a dark stain that spread from the containment's southern wall. The official caption read, "Post-incident area cleared due to hazard risk." He stared at it, the weight of it pressing down. Refugee support, hazard risk. He knew what that meant. They hadn't just sealed the reservoir, they had cut off water to the camp beside it. The very people they were meant to protect had been left without supply, displaced when the lines closed. He ran a hand through his hair, eyes burning as the memory bled through. He could almost see the faces now, the workers, the children hauling empty cans, the officers promising it was temporary. He hadn't known then, or maybe he hadn't wanted to. Shadow nudged his leg softly, grounding him in the present. Jack exhaled long and slow, staring at the photos again. Whoever had broken in hadn't wanted him to see these, which meant they were proof. Proof that the explosion hadn't been an accident. Proof that the project's failure had killed more than just a supply line. Outside, a truck rumbled in the distance, fading down the road. Jack looked toward the horizon where the hills met the sky and felt a chill run through him that had nothing to do with the wind. Jack sat at the table as dawn broke the soft gray light cutting through the dust that hung in the air. The photographs were still spread out in front of him, their edges curling slightly under the weight of the night. Shadow lay beside his chair, breathing evenly, now the wound along his side bandaged. Jack hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the images again, the reservoir, the refugee camp, the dark stain spreading like guilt over the land. He could no longer pretend it was just an old job, or that his part had ended when he left the service. The truth had caught up to him, and this time there was nowhere left to bury it. He turned on his phone and dialed Emily's number again. It went straight to voicemail. He left a short message, voice steady but low, asking her to meet him at the Gazette office that afternoon. When he hung up, he gathered the photographs and the copy of the project map, tucking them into an envelope. Before leaving, he knelt beside Shadow and rested a hand on his neck. "Stay here," he said softly. The dog's eyes met his, calm and steady, as if promising he would. The town was already awake when Jack arrived, people moving through their routines with the quiet rhythm of small places that rarely changed. He parked behind the Gazette building and walked inside. Emily was there waiting by her desk, her coat draped over the back of a chair. She looked up surprised. "Jack, I was going to call. I had car trouble yesterday, couldn't make it out to your place." He nodded once. "You might have saved yourself some trouble." He handed her the envelope. She opened it and froze as the photograph spilled across the desk. "Where did you get these?" she whispered. "From my trailer," he said. "Someone broke in, took the maps, left these. I think they wanted me to know what I was standing on." Emily examined the images, her brow furrowing as she pieced the story together. "This shows civilian structures. They said it was an uninhabited zone." Jack's voice was quiet but firm. "They lied. There was a refugee camp. We sealed the water system after the explosion. I didn't know what that meant until now." He watched her expression shift shock first, then resolve. "If you go public with this," she said, "it won't just hit the company. It'll drag the Corps, the county, everyone connected." Jack nodded. "Good. They should be dragged." By afternoon, the story broke online. Local veteran claims military contractor hid environmental disaster. The headline, spread fast, picked up by regional outlets within hours. The article detailed the old maps, the corporate link to Corwin Industries, and the photographs that showed the destroyed displacement support zone. It didn't take long for the backlash to begin. Residents from nearby counties flooded social media with questions. Former workers came forward with their own fragments of memory, and within a day, the mayor's office announced a review of all sealed sites along the Dry Creek Valley. But it was Jack's statement that turned the tide. When reporters gathered outside the Gazette the next morning, he stood among them, shoulders squared, eyes clear. The microphones caught his voice as he spoke. "My name is Jack Turner," he said. "In 1989, I was part of a Corps engineering unit assigned to seal a water containment project near this town. We were told it was unstable, that closing it would prevent a disaster. I didn't question the order, I followed it. I welded the lines shut myself. I didn't know that people living nearby depended on that water. I didn't know what cutting it off would do." The crowd was silent, the weight of his words falling heavy in the cool morning air. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," he continued. "I'm here because truth doesn't stay buried. The land remembers. The people remember. And now, so do I." Cameras clicked the sound like a soft rain. Emily stood a few steps back, watching him in silence. Later that evening, the news ran his confession alongside old footage of the cleanup. The grainy film showing workers in hazmat suits, trucks hauling away soil, and warning signs staked into the ground that read "Restricted Zone Contamination Risk." Jack sat on the porch as the light faded, listening to the hum of the television inside. Shadow lay beside him, head resting on his boot. The air smelled of sage and dust, just as it had the first day he arrived. But something in it felt different now, lighter, though not easier. He knew the confession wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't bring back the lost lives or undo the harm. But it had broken the silence that had hung over this place for decades. He had carried the guilt in silence long enough. The world might never care about one forgotten reservoir or one old soldier's mistake. But the truth was finally out, and that for now was enough. The first drops came 2 nights after Jack's confession aired. He had been sitting on the porch with Shadow, the air heavy with the smell of iron and sage, when the wind began to shift. It started as a whisper, a faint stirring through the grass, a tremor of thunder far off in the hills. The dog lifted his head, first ears pricked toward the horizon. Jack followed his gaze. For weeks, clouds had gathered and dispersed like a false promise, but this time they held together, dense and dark, rolling in from the west with slow certainty. By dawn, the sky had turned the color of steel. The radio crackled with a weather warning, flash flood risk across Flathead County. Jack stood at the window watching the dry creek behind the trailer twist under the first thin ribbons of rainwater. The sound was strange after so long without it. He stepped outside, letting the cold drops soak through his jacket. It wasn't gentle rain. It came fast, fierce, as though the land had waited years to drink and couldn't hold back any longer. Within minutes, the dirt turned to mud. The wind howled through the valley, and the air filled with the deep hum of distant thunder. Shadow barked once, pacing along the back fence, then sprinted toward the gully where the dry rift cut through the land. Jack followed, slipping in the mud. The dog stopped where they had dug, weeks ago, the trench now filling with brown water that rushed in streams around the exposed pipe. Jack crouched beside it, wiping rain from his eyes. The metal was slick and dark, but something about it caught the light, a glint from a seam near the weld he had examined before. The ground around it trembled slightly, the sound deep muffled like a heartbeat under the soil. He leaned closer, pressing a hand to the earth. The vibration grew stronger. Days of sustained rain had recharged the shallow aquifer upstream. With a check valve still intact somewhere higher in the line, and swelling clay exerting lateral stress pressure had a place to build but nowhere to go. Then, with a sudden crack that split through the roar of rain, the seam gave way. A rush of water burst from the pipe, exploding upward, sending mud and debris flying. Jack stumbled back as Shadow barked furiously, circling the torrent. The water was clear at first, then darkened with sediment as it roared free, cascading down the slope toward the old containment basin. The pressure had been building for years, sealed behind the welded cap until the storm had loosened the soil and the earth itself had decided to open it. Jack watched, breathless, as the stream widened, carving through the land like a living thing. It carried the scent of iron oil and something older, something buried. He could feel it in his chest, the strange mix of fear and awe of witnessing nature reclaim what men had tried to silence. He ran back to the trailer, grabbed his raincoat and camera, and returned to the edge of the flood. The water tore through the valley, cutting a new path toward the southern flats where the reservoir once stood. He could see it now, a wide stretch of barren earth, cracked and lifeless, until the rushing current began to fill it, pooling into hollows, washing over what had been forgotten. Shadow waded ahead, his fur plastered to his sides, barking into the wind. Jack followed the stream down to the basin, the rain hammering his shoulders. When he reached the bottom, he stopped short. The water had uncovered something beneath the soil slabs of concrete, tilted and half-buried, sliding free as the current carried away the dirt. Jack waded closer, his boots sinking into the soft mud. One of the slabs rolled over, revealing stenciled numbers along its edge, QMC 79, the mark of his old engineering unit. He brushed at the surface with trembling fingers. The paint was faded, but the numbers were clear. Another slab surfaced nearby, then another, each stamped with the same identifier. The rain drummed harder until it was all one sound thunder memory release. Jack stood there soaked and shivering, watching as the evidence of everything they'd buried rose back into view. The storm didn't stop. It poured through the night, the wind wailing across the valley like a voice carried from years ago. By morning, the reservoir basin had filled halfway a muddy lake, forming where concrete once sealed the truth. Jack walked the perimeter at dawn, taking photos of each fragment. Some pieces bore dates, some names scratched by workers long forgotten. The current had carried them from deep beneath the sealed lines, tearing through what had been hidden for decades. Shadow followed close, nosing the edge of the new water, but pulling back when Jack tugged his collar, the dog's fur streaked with clay. Jack crouched beside him, resting a hand on the dog's back. "We didn't dig deep enough," he murmured. "The land did the rest." He looked toward the horizon where the rain still fell in sheets over the hills. The water shimmered in the dim light, reflecting the gray sky above. For the first time, the valley looked alive, and for the first time, Jack felt the weight of his confession begin to move, not because it was forgiven, but because the truth had finally surfaced, undeniable and uncontained. The land had spoken louder than any report, louder than any denial. It had torn open its scars and demanded to be seen. The sound of rushing water filled the air again, steady and endless, as if the earth itself was breathing. When the rain finally stopped, the valley looked reborn. The air carried the sweet, heavy scent of wet earth, and where there had once been cracks and dust, now pools of clear water shimmered under the gray morning light. Jack stood by the edge of what used to be the containment basin, the mud clinging to his boots, his jacket still damp from the storm. Behind him, the trailer gleamed faintly in the sun that had just begun to break through the clouds, its tin walls glinting like a second chance. The water had done what decades of silence could not. It had unearthed the truth, piece by piece, until the ground itself testified. Reporters came, then government trucks, then environmental crews. They set up fences, cameras, floodlights. Scientists tested the water, confirming traces of the contaminants, long rumored but never proven. The stamped concrete fragments with QMC-79 became undeniable proof that the site had been military, and that the sealing of the reservoir had led to environmental collapse downstream. Jack spoke to them all when they asked, never hiding his role, never excusing it. "We were following orders," he said once, "but that doesn't mean we didn't have a choice to see." The footage spread faster than he expected, and suddenly his name was everywhere, not as the man who buried the truth, but the man who unearthed it. Veterans groups reached out environmental activists, too. For the first time in years, the calls that came weren't from creditors or lawyers. They were from people who wanted to help rebuild. Over the next months, cleanup began in earnest. Excavators removed the broken concrete, and water management teams restored the original flow lines that had once fed the valley. Jack stayed working alongside them, his hands once again rough from tools and steel. Shadow was never far, trotting between workers, keeping watch as though he understood the mission wasn't finished yet. Following an EPA-led remedial review and a Section 106 consultation with the State Historic Preservation Office, the site was recognized as historically significant and designated for rehabilitation under a new name, the Veterans Water Project. Jack didn't suggest it, but when they asked him to lead it, he didn't refuse. He moved his trailer up the ridge overlooking the basin, turning it into a small field office and home all in one. Every morning he brewed coffee on the old propane stove and looked out over the valley as water mist rose in soft plumes, catching the sunrise like steam from a healing wound. The land was changing, grass growing where ash once lay, small birds returning to the reeds, even the faint buzz of insects breaking the long silence of dead soil. One afternoon, a local news crew filmed him walking along the reservoir's edge. The reporter asked how it felt to see it all renewed. Jack paused, watching Shadow lap from the shallow edge, his reflection rippling across the surface. "It's not about redemption," he said quietly. "It's about repair. We broke something, and we're trying to make it whole again." The clip went viral in a way that made him uncomfortable, but it also drew donations, volunteers, and veterans looking for purpose. Over 18 to 24 months, the once barren valley became a phased site of work and healing. Modular homes lined the western slope, housing workers and their families. Phase 1 restored controlled flows to support test plots and limited irrigation. Phase 2 brought community elements online, including a small memorial park near the southern bank, simple, built from salvaged stone and steel. On the day of the dedication, the sky was impossibly blue, the kind that stretched forever. People gathered from across the county, local officials, veterans, families of those who had once lived in the displacement support camp. They stood shoulder to shoulder under the same sun that had once scorched the land dry. Jack wore a clean shirt and the same weathered boots. When his name was called, he stepped to the podium, Shadow at his heel. He didn't have a speech. Instead, he held a small bronze plaque in his hands, the metal warm from the sun. He walked to the water's edge, knelt, and fixed it into the stone foundation at the foot of the new observation deck. The words etched on it were simple, for those who built and those who stayed. When he stood again, the wind carried across the water, soft but sure, rippling the reflection of the crowd. People clapped, but he barely heard it. He looked down at Shadow, who had settled beside his leg-eyes half-closed tail, gently tapping against the grass. The dog lifted his head, gazing across the water as clouds drifted above, their shapes mirrored perfectly on the calm surface. Jack smiled, the lines on his face deep but no longer hard. He reached down, scratching behind Shadow's ear. "We did all right," he murmured. The valley stretched out before them, alive again. Children's laughter echoed from the far bank, where volunteers planted young trees. The air shimmered with light, and the smell of wet soil mixed with new grass. Jack took a deep breath, the decades of weight dissolving into something that no longer hurt. The land was honest again. It held its scars and its promise of renewal. For the first time, Jack realized he had found what he'd been searching for since the war ended. Not a home built of walls and roofs, but a place that forgave him enough to let him stay. Shadow pressed his head lightly against Jack's knee, the way he always did when the world grew quiet. Together they stood by the water. Two survivors bound not by guilt anymore, but by the peace that comes after the storm. If this story moved you, take a second to hit like and subscribe. It helps more people find stories like this one. I'd love to know which moment hit you the hardest and where in the world are you watching from. Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one.